Many governments knew very well from the start of the pandemic that the threat was far greater than just COVID. Any country seriously affected by the pandemic was particularly vulnerable to a second or third problem that could arise simultaneously, another pathogen or a cyber attack. No government seemed to want to unsettle the population with the scary reality, and since everything that has to do with biological weapons is subject to the strictest secrecy. One could have explained to the citizens that the unpopular measures to contain COVID are not only taking place because of the virus, but in order to reduce the country's particular vulnerability as quickly as possible, so as not to suddenly experience 2 or 3 crises at the same time that completely overwhelm us. No country wants to tell how vulnerable or well protected it is against biological attacks or combo attacks, so as not to pass on valuable information to its enemies. In the book The Great Influenza by John Barry, we learn vividly how the second wave of the Spanish flu devastated American cities around 100 years ago, and the US government ordered newspapers to trivialize the situation. The first wave still seemed manageable. The second was hell, as the virus had become more adapted to humans through the mechanism called passage after passing through many people. The Arkansas Gazette newspaper reported, "Spanish influenza is just a regular flu, the familiar fever and chills." Thousands upon thousands of newspapers across the country carried the exact same talking point, that it was just a common flu. In 1918, the publishers were threatened by the US government during the Spanish flu only print constructive things, such as recommendations for preventive measures. The Los Angeles public health director said, "There would be no cause for alarm if normal protective measures are followed. Just wash your hands and that's enough." 48 hours later, in a panic, he had all public events and meeting places closed. The Bronxville, New York Review Press and the Reporter reported nothing on the Spanish flu for a long time. Then people complained about alarmism. Fear was supposedly the bigger problem than the illness. The Illinois Superintendent of Public Health wanted to propose in a confidential meeting that all stores and other companies be temporarily closed. He was rigorously blocked. Fear was killing more people than the epidemic, it was said. At Cook County Hospital, there was a death rate of around 40% from influenza. Literary Digest, one of the most widely read publications in the country, said, "Fear is the greatest enemy." Tens of other newspapers carried the exact same mantra. Vicks VapoRub advertisements during the Spanish flu said the illness was just the old flu with a new name. Mayors and governors were quoted churning out exactly the same statements. The US government's public health service had ready-to-use printing plates made with identical propaganda and sent the plates to tens of thousands of newspapers. Millions of pamphlets and posters containing the nonsense were also printed with money from the Red Cross. Health tips were spread like, "Be hygienic, chew your food thoroughly." The Journal of the American Medical Association knew better at the time and rejected all the official dangerous and negligent trivializing propaganda. In any case, people were able to watch with their own eyes as their fellow human beings died away in alarming numbers. The Trivialization campaign had a deadly effect on the audience. The publication The Nation reported on a secret US military study, US Northcom Branch Plan 3560, Pandemic Influenza and Infectious Disease Response, dated January 6, 2017. New coronaviruses are cited as a major threat to US national security. A particularly quick reaction is essential in an emergency because there could be follow-up attacks, which means that an attacker uses a second pathogen against the US in the middle of the pandemic, or maybe a cyber attack. In the documentary film Hackers Wanted, Dr. John Arkia speaks out. At around minute 28, he explains that an attacker could combine a cyber attack with a biological pathogen. If the power goes out, this drives people onto the streets in search of information and other necessities, where they then infect each other. During the George W. Bush administration, Arkia was one of many advisors to former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. A statement from the Council of Europe Committee on Combating Terrorism expressed exactly what every military and every secret intelligence service already knew from the beginning of the COVID pandemic: the danger of a second strike, a double tap. Worded carefully, it warns that terrorist groups will not forget the lesson from the corona pandemic. Quote, "The damage is rapid and potentially global." The statement says that attacks with biological weapons would paralyze societies for long periods of time. The United States is increasingly vulnerable to cyber attacks, targeting hospitals, food supplies, or other vital facilities during the coronavirus pandemic, senior government officials said. As yet, unidentified attackers have already tried to overload the computer networks of the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs. Hackers would also try to send fake communications after breaking into systems in the healthcare sector, for example, in order to gain control of other systems. U.S. Attorney General William Barr had already warned that there will be serious consequences if an attack like the one on the Department of Health and Human Services or a devastating disinformation campaign is traced to an opposing government. In the 1990s, a critical article in the Washington Post prompted an investigation into the practices of Harvard researchers in China. Now, the New York Times reported in a similar style about the technology transfers from America to China. It says, China uses DNA to track its people, with help from American expertise. Chinese authorities turned to a Massachusetts company and a prominent Yale researcher as they built a vast surveillance and control system. Millions of people were persuaded to give blood samples using a mixture of coercion and promises of a free health check in China. These included both Muslim Uyghurs, some of whom are interned in concentration camps, but also ordinary citizens. Scientists working for China's police used equipment from the Thermo Fisher Company in the US state of Massachusetts. To compare the Uyghur DNA, the Chinese sought help from the famous US geneticist Kenneth Kidd from Yale University. Yale traces its roots to the elites of the British Empire, who sabotaged the ancient Chinese imperial dynasties, waged the Opium Wars, and ultimately manipulated the Chinese Civil War between nationalists and communists. The Yale Secret Society Skull and Bones carried out extensive Secret Service operations in China. Virtually all American ambassadors to Communist China were members of Skull and Bones, and from the same environment, such as the Bechtel Company, came essential help with which China could become a superpower. Thermo Fisher said after the New York Times report that it would no longer sell equipment to Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are being persecuted by the government. Dr. Kidd said he didn't know how this expertise was used by the Chinese. Between 2016 and 2017 alone, 36 million people were recorded with their genetic data. Dr. Kidd's Chinese partners are from the Ministry of Public Security, essentially the communist police force. Years ago, Kidd got along well with Li Kaixia, China's leading forensic scientist. In the 2010 document War for Biological Supremacy, Guo Jiwei, a professor at the 3rd Military Medical University, emphasizes the influence of biology on future warfare. In 2015, then president of the Academy of Military Medical Sciences, He Fushu, argued that biotechnology will become the new strategic leadership of national defense, from biomaterials to brain control weapons. He is now vice president of the Academy of Military Sciences, which runs China's military science enterprise. Biology is among the 7 new areas of warfare, discussed in a 2017 book by Zhang Shibo, a retired general and former president of the National Defense University. The 2017 edition of Science of Military Strategy, a textbook published by the PLA's National Defense University and considered relatively authoritative, included for the first time a section on biology as a field of military combat, which also discussed the potential for new types of biological warfare, which could include specific ethnic genetic attacks. Dani Shoham's 2015 study, China's Biological Warfare Program, an integrative study with special references to biological weapons capabilities, funded by the Indian Ministry of Defense, sheds light on China's capabilities and how bioweapons research has been hidden and divided among various facilities in the country. The result of this analysis indicates 12 facilities attached to the defense establishment, plus 30 facilities attached to the PLA that are involved in the research, development, production, testing, or storage of biowarfare agents. Even the most modern, huge genetic research facilities are being misused. Quote, with the obvious option of upgrading through genetic engineering processes on the one hand, and the experimental option of modifying certain biowarfare agents, at least theoretically in such a way that their effect against certain ethnic groups is increased. Years ago, race-specific bioweapons were still considered a thing of the future. Like any dictatorship, China maintains a narrow-minded victim mentality mixed with paranoia. The official Chinese news agency Xinhua reported in 2002 that between 1933 and 1945, at least 270,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians were killed by Japanese germ warfare troops. This meant Japanese programs and facilities such as Unit 731. The Japanese general in charge worked for the Americans after World War II. The United States is said to have used biological weapons against Koreans and Chinese during the Korean War. China, in turn, appeared to cooperate with the Soviets. Quote, supposedly the USSR conducted experiments with plague, anthrax, and cholera in Soviet-occupied Mongolia towards the end of World War II. Later, trials of various vaccines were conducted by the USSR in Mongolia over a long period of time. What with the continued communist brotherhood between China and the USSR and their strategic cooperation in general, and the Chinese people's awareness of the USSR's colossal biowarfare program in particular, and which, to a certain extent, accompanied persecution. China joined the Bioweapons Treaty in 1984, but in a report entitled Adherence to and Compliance with Arms Control Agreements, the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency claimed China maintained an offensive biological weapons program throughout the 1980s. The program involved the development, manufacture, storage, or other acquisition or maintenance of biological warfare agents. A major institution of China's National Development and Reform Commission is the Beijing State Research Center for Viral Biotechnology Engineering, which is affiliated with the Beijing Carbon Technology Shareholding Company. Then there is the China National Biotech Corporation. This has a research and development center in Beijing and various production facilities that are part of a system called the Institute of Biological Products and are strategically located in various cities in China. Numerous universities and military departments are also involved. You also have the appropriate carrier systems, including warheads containing bacterial biowarfare agents, particularly smoke bombs, aerosol bombs, and paper canister-type containers. All are manufactured in China by a facility called the Yan'an Bacteriological Factory. According to a U.S. Department of Defense report, China is expected to have cruise missiles by 2010, which have a certain camouflage ability with biological warheads. General John Allen, General Ben Hodges, and Professor Julian Lindley French published the book Future War, Threat and Defense of Europe. With their combined 100 years of professional experience, they express themselves more clearly than one would expect from think tanks or politicians. According to the feared scenario, many Western soldiers will contract COVID-29 in 2029, while Russian and Chinese troops will be significantly less affected. If US forces are impacted by just 15%, it will already be a disaster, because Europe is too weak to defend itself effectively. The US had concentrated many forces in the Pacific region because of China, and was hastily shipping troops to the EU in that scenario. But a series of cyber attacks is crippling military and civilian infrastructure. Terror through sleeper cells and deliberately spread misinformation cause chaos. In lightning strikes, the Russians and Chinese make conquests without having to resort to nuclear weapons and are then satisfied with the results. China in particular would not have been able to build up the capacity to be able to create a COVID-29 scenario without the help of the West. At an international conference on chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, Yale immunologist Professor Akiko Iwasaki presented her latest research results. Even COVID infections that seem mild on the surface can cause all sorts of complicated and long-term damage to the body, also in interaction with other viruses such as Epstein-Barr. Experts spoke of an event that incapacitates masses of people. Every affected citizen who suffers from long-term problems with concentration and lack of physical strength and chronic exhaustion must be replaced at work and needs help from other people. Western industrialized countries were plagued from the outset by risk factors such as obesity, older average age, and cardiovascular problems. In public, civil authorities acted according to the instructions, as if the pandemic had a natural origin. However, a lot of things in biosecurity are secret, and higher up in the hierarchy, the boundaries between civil and military becomes blurred. The military is certainly interested in the ongoing mass damage to the population caused by COVID, and for the question of who might have had the motive to intentionally spread a disease that was hitting Western industrialized countries, China's densely packed urban centers, and Russia's weak healthcare system. Specialist literature and studies show how the bioweapons logic works. The search is not only for killer super epidemics and super deadly pathogens, but also for incapacitating agents, pathogens that weaken an opponent. Even those who do not suffer from significant long COVID damage experience short-term symptoms, such as significant difficulty concentrating, and studies have shown that many do not even notice that their performance has fundamentally decreased. Yale immunologist Professor Akiko Iwasaki found infections in the central nervous system, autoimmunity disorders, tissue damage, and inflammation caused in the body by infection or other reasons. They tested the latter hypothesis by giving experimental mice ACE1 receptors in their lungs and infected them with COVID. 7 days later, Upregulation of cytokines in the cerebrospinal fluid suggested that the inflammation in the lungs had reached the central nervous system. These cytokines remained elevated throughout the 7 weeks of the study. A study by the Stanford University School of Medicine showed weaknesses in brain function comparable to chemo brain, meaning the well-known side effects of chemotherapy. Affected are memory, attention, logical thinking, and the ability to handle more complex tasks or multiple tasks at the same time. A virus that spreads faster and more powerfully than the flu and leads to impairments and even damage to the brain. A virus that makes you more stupid. Something like this would be on the wish list of biological weapons experts. A biological attack does not have to correspond at all to the Hollywood cliché of a killer virus with an extremely high death rate and fully hazmat soldiers setting up checkpoints. Many people are already cognitively impaired and don't have the concentration to read real books on a regular basis. Many people cannot function at all without high doses of caffeine and the abuse of amphetamines in the form of Adderall, etc. There's a number of good non-fiction books to get an idea of bioweapons research. A Higher Form of Killing, Baseless by Nichols and Baker, Germs, Biological Weapons in America's Secret War, Clouds of Secrecy, the Army's germ warfare tests over populated areas, The United States and Biological Warfare, Secrets from the Early Cold War in Korea, Biological Weapons from the Invention of State-Sponsored Programs to Contemporary Bioterrorism, Factories of Death, Japanese Biological Warfare, and the American Cover-Up, and The Demon in the Freezer, A True Story. Many things that were produced as biological weapons should only have a death rate of around 1%, because then the inhibition threshold for using the weapon is lower and the opponent is just slowed down and weakened. The opponent must take care of his sick, manage the pandemic, and support the economy. But there was also enough anthrax production and smallpox production to wipe out almost the entire world. Huge facilities in Kazakhstan produced the agent, which had a 90% fatality rate, was further developed using laboratory technology from the original anthrax and smallpox pathogen. There's also a new version of smallpox with 30% lethality. You can silently spread viruses at an airport and the passengers then spread it throughout the country. By the time people show symptoms, it's already too late. In December of 1997, the Pentagon announced that it would vaccinate all 2.4 million active-duty soldiers and reservists against anthrax. This required 6 injections plus an annual refresher, a booster. A group of experts in pathogens and military affairs attempted to investigate this endeavor. This resulted in the book Germs, Bioweapons in America's Secret War. After 9/11 and the anthrax letters, there was a dramatic expansion of biodefense, and they weren't just looking at state actors. In the American Bioweapons Laboratory Fort Detrick, hundreds of doctors had already become infected with their own pathogens, and highly dangerous substances have also disappeared. In 1968, a centrifuge containing psittacosis bacteria burst, causing high fever and extreme pneumonia in those affected. The head of the long-secret US program was George W. Merck from the well-known pharmaceutical company family. Similar to nuclear weapons, corresponding amounts of anthrax and botulinum toxin have the potential to kill billions of people. In open-air experiments, substitute materials were used to test how an attack on Soviet cities would work. In the early days, the main interest was in bacteria, but then shifted to the more complicated and smaller viruses, which did not necessarily have to have a high death rate, because if, for example, you can make some of the enemy soldiers sick for weeks with Q fever, the comrades have to look after the sick, which ties up a lot of resources. In 1956, Soviet Defense Minister Georgy Zhukov said that biological weapons were part of modern wars. On an island in the Aral, war materials were being produced in large stock numbers, while the Americans in Pine Bluff opened up their arsenal with Q fever, encephalitis, African Rift Valley fever, etc. US General Lemnitzer said something like this could be used in the Philippines. Under the supposed peace dove, John F. Kennedy, the budget for biological weapons was increased and all sorts of large corporations were on board, such as GE, Booz Allen, Lockheed, Rand, Monsanto, Goodyear, and General Dynamics. Even General Mills, a breakfast cereal manufacturer, built spray systems for airplanes. New types of missile warheads had a payload of 720 mini-bombs, enough to contaminate 60 square miles. Operation Marshall Plan was a top-secret plan for a biological attack against Cuba that would weaken the country, followed by a US invasion. General Lemnitzer was also behind Operation Northwoods, the plan for a false flag attack to provide justification for an invasion. Defense Secretary McNamara played dumb and said he had never heard of Operation Marshall Plan. There is evidence that crops in Cuba had been damaged by biological pathogens. In the Eastern Bloc, there were also repeated accusations directed at NATO, such as the alleged dropping of Colorado potato beetles. The Americans had plans for combined attacks consisting of 2 pathogens plus a biotoxin to confuse the enemy. It was mainly older people who would die as a result. The younger ones would be sick for a long time. Thousands of gallons of this mixture were made from staphylococcal enterotoxin B, Venezuelan encephalitis, and Q fever. The first effects would have set in after hours, and then it would wear off. The next agent would then become acute immediately. You didn't have to bomb anything, you just had to put the enemy out of action. Classic smallpox has a 33% death rate, and it's contagious through coughing or contaminated clothing, towels, etc. The trick is to produce appropriate quantities using the freeze-drying process so that the pathogens have a longer shelf life and do not have to be produced freshly and soon become less potent. A test of spraying harmless pathogens at the Washington airport found that 1 in 12 travelers would have been infected and spread the pathogen around the world. The incubation period is 12 days, so by the time symptoms become visible, it is already too late. There was the idea of using smallpox to sabotage the Ho Chi Minh Trail during the Vietnam War. Using appropriate techniques, anthrax can be produced quickly that breaks down with sunlight and oxygen so that the attacked area is not contaminated for decades. You can also insert plague genes into E. coli or manipulate pathogens so that common vaccines fail. For a long time, with the appropriate accreditation, it was relatively easy for the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein to purchase pathogens from the US, such as the particularly sensitive anthrax strain Volume 1B. In 1989, Soviet defector Vladimir Pasechnik reported that tens of thousands of experts in the USSR were working on biological weapons, developing warheads that could not be stopped. Revelations that the program was 10 times larger than previously suspected were confirmed in 1992 by defector Ken Alibekov, the program's second most important scientist. Pasechnik initially specialized in the study of polymers for biological purposes at the Institute for Higher Molecular Compounds in Leningrad. The intent was to develop new antibiotics and other treatments. In 1974, at the age of 37, Pasechnik was invited by a general in the Soviet Defense Ministry to set up his own biotechnology institute in Leningrad and was given a virtually unlimited budget to purchase equipment in the West and recruit the best personnel available. The laboratory he created was actually part of the nationwide biopreparat program. According to Pasechnik, the institute, with around 400 employees, conducted research into modifying cruise missiles to spread the plague. The weapon system would operate by flying low to avoid early warning systems and using robotic vehicles to spray clouds of aerosolized pathogens over unsuspecting enemies. The team managed to create an aerosolized version of the plague microbe that could survive outside of a laboratory. This version of the organism had been genetically engineered to be resistant to antibiotics. So, in summary, COVID was not the real sensation here. COVID just highlighted the much larger sphere of biological warfare and biological terrorism. So remember, the measures to contain COVID were not just targeted at COVID itself, but it was to prevent double tap attacks. They wanted to get this pandemic handled as quickly as possible so as to shorten the window where one would be vulnerable to these double or even triple attacks. Now, this is something that governments could have communicated to the public, but this could have caused more panic. Maybe it would have given away some of the biodefense secrets. It is interesting that no influencers out there on the internet, nobody in the media really cared to explain this very fundamental issue of double and triple attacks. So you can argue all day about the way the COVID pandemic was handled, the mask mandates and closing down stores and sporting events. And you can argue that maybe we could have done a little bit less of this and maybe we could have done with less of that. But it was never just about COVID.